Handcuffs clicked around 16-year-old Zoe's wrists as Officer Mitchell sneered, "Maybe this'll teach you to respect authority." He had no idea that the woman stepping out of the black SUV behind him was Captain Jasmine Washington, Special Forces veteran with 2 Purple Hearts, and the girl's very protective mother. Welcome back to the Powder Room Tales. If you're new, hit subscribe and join our family. Tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Washington, New York, London? Wherever you are, may peace and favor follow you today. Now, let's dive into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Willowbrook Police Department as Officer Derek Mitchell adjusted his utility belt and checked his reflection in the station's glass doors. 15 years on the force, commendations for community service, and a spotless record, at least on paper. At 42, he'd convinced himself he was one of the good ones, the kind of cop who served and protected without prejudice. "Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez called from the dispatch desk. "You're on patrol in Sector 7 today. Keep an eye out. There have been reports of suspicious activity in the Oakwood neighborhood." Derek nodded, grabbing his keys. Oakwood, the affluent suburb where million-dollar homes lined tree-shaded streets. It was the kind of assignment that usually meant dealing with noise complaints and the occasional domestic disturbance among the wealthy. Easy money, safe territory. But as Derek drove through the pristine neighborhood, a familiar tension crept up his spine. Something about young black faces in predominantly white spaces always triggered his hypervigilance, a reaction he'd never fully examined. He told himself it was just good police work, being aware, staying alert, protecting the community. His radio crackled with a routine call about a suspicious person walking through Oakwood. Derek's jaw tightened. He'd handled dozens of these calls, and they usually followed the same pattern: concerned citizen, thorough investigation, innocent explanation. But the adrenaline still kicked in, the same instinctive response that had kept him alive during his years on the force. Derek Mitchell had grown up in a working-class family where his father, a retired police officer, had taught him that respect was earned through authority. "Sometimes you have to remind people who's in charge," his father had said. "It's not personal, it's professional." Now, as Derek patrolled the quiet streets, those words echoed in his mind. He wasn't racist. He had black colleagues, had arrested white criminals, had always followed proper procedure. But somewhere along the way, proper procedure had become tangled with assumptions he'd never questioned. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife. "Emma's recital is tonight at 7. Please don't be late again." Derek's chest tightened with familiar guilt. Another promise he might have to break, another disappointment in his daughter's eyes. Police work demanded sacrifices, but lately it felt like he was sacrificing the wrong things. 3 miles away, Captain Jasmine Washington stood in her immaculate kitchen, packing lunch for her 16-year-old daughter with the same precision she'd once used to plan military operations. 2 tours in Afghanistan, countless classified missions, and enough medals to fill a display case. But nothing had prepared her for the daily war of raising a black teenager in America. "Mom, you doing that thing again," Zoe said with an affectionate smile, watching her mother fold the sandwich wrapper with military corners. "What thing?" Jazz asked, though she knew exactly what Zoe meant. "The thing where you treat my lunch like it's gonna survive enemy fire." Jazz laughed in spite of herself. At 38, she was still adjusting to civilian life after 20 years in the Army. Some habits died hard, especially the ones that had kept her soldiers alive. "Old habits, baby girl. Besides, presentation matters." Zoe Washington was everything Jazz had dreamed of when she had carried her to safety during the chaos of her early 20s. Honor Roll student, debate team captain, college-bound with a full scholarship already secured. She was smart, articulate, and beautiful, which Jazz knew from experience could be both a blessing and a target in the wrong circumstances.
"Remember what we talked about if you ever interact with police," Jazz said, her voice taking on the serious tone that meant this wasn't a suggestion. Zoe sighed, reciting the familiar litany. "Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Hands visible at all times. No sudden movements. Comply now, challenge later. And if they ask you anything beyond basic identification, I invoke my right to remain silent and ask to call my mother."
Jazz nodded, satisfied but heartbroken that these conversations were necessary. She'd fought for her country's freedom, had earned the respect of hardened soldiers and commanding officers, and had been trusted with national security secrets. But none of that would matter if her daughter encountered the wrong officer on the wrong day. "I love you, baby girl," Jazz said, pulling Zoe into a fierce hug. "Be smart, be safe." "Always am, Mom. Stop worrying so much." But Jazz couldn't stop worrying. She'd seen too much, experienced too much, to believe that good intentions and proper behavior were enough to guarantee safety. The world was changing, but not fast enough for her peace of mind. After Zoe left for her volunteer work at the community center, Jazz settled into her home office to review security protocols for her consulting firm. Military discipline had translated well into civilian leadership. Her company specialized in training corporate executives in crisis management and strategic thinking. Her phone sat on the desk, fully charged and within reach. Always within reach. It was a habit from her military days, but also from her reality as the mother of a black teenager. She'd trained her daughter well, had given her every advantage, had prepared for every scenario she could imagine. But no amount of preparation could account for every variable, every possible encounter, every split-second decision that could change everything. Jazz glanced at the framed photo on her desk, Zoe in her cap and gown at her high school honors ceremony, beaming with pride and possibility. Her daughter was destined for greatness, had already overcome obstacles that would have stopped lesser people. She was respectful, responsible, and remarkable. She was also 16, black, and walking through a world that didn't always see her the way Jazz did. The morning passed quietly, filled with conference calls and strategic planning sessions. Jazz threw herself into work the way she'd always done, compartmentalizing worry into a small, manageable box in the back of her mind. Control what you can control, adapt to what you can't. Military wisdom that had served her well in both war and peace. Her phone remained silent, which was exactly how she preferred it during Zoe's volunteer hours. No news was good news, especially when your teenager was navigating the world without you. But as the afternoon stretched toward evening, Jazz felt the familiar tingle of intuition that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. Something was coming, she could feel it in her bones, the same way she'd sensed enemy movement in the mountains of Afghanistan. She checked her phone again, noting the time. Zoe should be finishing her volunteer work soon, should be walking home through the safe streets of their carefully chosen neighborhood. The same neighborhood where Jazz had bought their house specifically because it was supposed to be different, supposed to be better. Jazz had fought for her country, had earned her place at every table, had commanded respect through competence and courage. She'd broken barriers and exceeded expectations, had proven that excellence was the best revenge against prejudice. But none of that would matter if her daughter became another statistic, another headline, another hashtag. The phone remained silent, but Jazz's warrior instincts were fully awake now. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a clock was ticking toward a moment that would test everything she'd learned about strategy, survival, and the lengths a mother would go to protect her child. In less than an hour, Captain Jasmine Washington would discover that some battles never end. They just change location. What unconscious biases or assumptions do you carry that might affect how you see and interact with others? Share this story if you believe every child deserves to walk through the world safely, regardless of their skin color. What conversations are we avoiding that we should be having? The call came in at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Suspicious person walking through Oakwood subdivision, the dispatcher's voice crackled through Officer Derek Mitchell's radio. Caller reports a black female, approximately 16 years old, doesn't belong in the neighborhood. Derek's pulse quickened as he turned his patrol car toward Oakwood Street. The tree-lined street was picture-perfect suburban America, manicured lawns, luxury cars and driveways, and the kind of quiet prosperity that bred both comfort and suspicion of outsiders. He spotted her immediately, a young black girl walking purposefully down the sidewalk, a volunteer ID badge visible on her green polo shirt, a backpack slung over one shoulder. She moved with confidence, her posture straight, completely unaware that she'd become the subject of someone's 911 call. His training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, establish control, protect the community. The fact that she looked harmless, honor student, volunteer badge, respectful demeanor, didn't change protocol. Suspicious was suspicious, and in his experience, appearances could be deceiving.
He pulled his cruiser to the curb and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his utility belt. The girl noticed him immediately. Her step slowed but did not stop. Good, she wasn't running, which was always a positive sign. "Excuse me, miss," Derek called out, using his authoritative but non-threatening tone. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Zoe Washington stopped walking, her heart rate spiking despite her mother's countless rehearsals for this exact scenario. "Stay calm, be respectful, comply now, challenge later." Jazz's voice echoed in her head as she turned to face the approaching officer. "Yes, sir," Zoe said, her voice steady despite the anxiety crawling up her spine. She kept her hands visible, exactly as her mother had taught her. "I received a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood," Derek said, studying her face for signs of deception. "Can you tell me what you're doing here?" "I volunteer at the Willowbrook Community Center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I was walking home after helping with the after-school program." Derek's eyes narrowed slightly. The girl was articulate, polite, seemingly innocent. But that's exactly what someone up to no good would want him to think. His father's voice whispered in the back of his mind. "They'll lie to your face with a smile, son. Don't let your guard down." "This is a private neighborhood," Derek said, stepping closer. "Do you live here?" "No, sir. I live in Maplewood Heights, about a mile from here. I take this route because it's the safest path home." Something in Derek's expression shifted. Maplewood Heights. That was where the subsidized housing was, where the problems came from. His assumptions crystallized into certainty, and his demeanor hardened accordingly. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, losing any pretense of friendliness. Zoe's stomach dropped, but she complied, reaching slowly into her backpack for her student ID. "My name is Zoe Washington. I'm a junior at Willowbrook High School." Derek examined the ID with exaggerated suspicion, as if looking for signs it was fake. "What were you really doing in this neighborhood, Zoe? And don't lie to me." "I told you the truth, sir. I volunteer at the community center and I was walking home." "Walking home from where, exactly? Through a neighborhood where you don't belong?" The words hit Zoe like a slap. Where you don't belong. The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that her presence was inherently wrong made her chest tighten with anger and hurt. "I belong on any public sidewalk in this city," Zoe said quietly, her voice trembling slightly with controlled emotion. "I haven't done anything wrong." Derek's jaw tightened. The girl was getting defensive, challenging his authority, exactly the kind of behavior that needed to be corrected immediately. "Are you getting an attitude with me?" "No, sir. I'm just trying to understand why I'm being stopped when I haven't committed any crime." "The crime is trespassing and suspicious behavior," Derek snapped, his patience wearing thin. In his mind, he was protecting the good people of Oakwood from potential trouble. The girl's educated speech and volunteer badge didn't change the fact that she didn't belong here. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back."
He ordered. Zoe's world tilted. What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong. I said turn around. Derek's voice rose as he reached for his handcuffs. The girls affirming all his suspicions. Innocent people cooperated, guilty ones argued. Please, sir, you can call the community center. Ask them about their volunteer program. Call my school. I'm on the honor roll. But Derek was beyond listening. The girl's excuses sounded rehearsed. Her emotional response felt manipulative, and his authority was being challenged in daylight. He grabbed Zoe's wrist, spinning her around with unnecessary force. You have the right to remain silent, he began, clicking the handcuffs around her small wrists as she sobbed in confusion and terror. I want to call my mother, Zoe whispered, the words coming out between ragged breaths. Maybe this'll teach you to respect authority, he sneered, tightening the cuffs with satisfaction. Another problem solved, another lesson taught. The neighborhood was safe, order was maintained, and justice was served. He had no idea that the black SUV pulling up behind his patrol car carried Captain Jasmine Washington, fresh from a security consultation meeting, her heart already racing because her daughter was 15 minutes late checking in.
Jazz stepped out of her vehicle and took in the scene with the trained eye of a combat veteran. Her honor student daughter, in handcuffs, tears streaming down her face, while a white police officer stood over her with obvious satisfaction. The world went silent, except for the sound of Jazz's heartbeat thundering in her ears. This was the moment every black parent dreaded, the scenario that haunted her nightmares, the confrontation she'd prepared for but prayed would never come. Officer, Jazz's voice cut through the evening air like a blade, military command authority making Derek's spine straighten involuntarily. You have 30 seconds to explain why my daughter is in handcuffs. Derek turned, ready to dismiss another angry parent, but the words died in his throat. The woman approaching him moved with lethal precision, her bearing unmistakably military, her eyes holding the kind of controlled fury that had been forged in combat zones. Ma'am, your daughter was acting suspiciously in a neighborhood where— My daughter, Jazz interrupted, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow more terrifying than any scream, is an honor student walking home from her volunteer work at the community center. What suspicious activity exactly did you observe? Derek felt his confidence beginning to crack. Something about this woman's presence was making him second-guess every decision he'd made in the last 10 minutes. She was in a neighborhood where she doesn't belong. Doesn't belong? Jazz repeated, and Derek realized with growing horror that he just said the quiet part out loud. On a public sidewalk, in the United States of America, where exactly does my daughter belong, Officer Mitchell? He managed, his voice barely audible. Officer Mitchell, Jazz said, and somehow her calm tone was more devastating than any explosion of anger. I am Captain Jasmine Washington, United States Army Special Forces. I have 2 Purple Hearts and 20 years of military service defending the Constitution that guarantees my daughter's right to walk on any public street in this country. Derek's hands began to shake as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. The handcuffed girl wasn't a suspicious character. She was the daughter of a decorated war hero, and he'd just destroyed his career in less than 10 minutes. But Jazz wasn't done. You are going to remove those handcuffs from my daughter immediately. You are going to apologize for traumatizing a child, and then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what suspicious behavior actually means. As Derek fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling too badly to work the lock, he realized that everything he thought he knew about policing, about authority, about who belonged where, was about to be challenged by a mother whose love was stronger than his ignorance. The real education was about to begin.
How do our unconscious biases influence split-second decisions, and what responsibility do we have to examine them before they cause harm? Share if you believe every child deserves to walk through their community safely. What conversations about bias and belonging are happening in your family? The tension in Interview Room 2 at Willowbrook Police Department was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Derek Mitchell sat across from Captain Jasmine Washington, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white with the effort of maintaining composure. Between them, like a canyon carved by centuries of systemic injustice, lay the incident report that had shattered his comfortable assumptions about himself. "I followed proper protocol," Derek said for the third time, his voice strained but defiant. "The call came in about suspicious activity. I responded appropriately to what I observed." Jazz's dark eyes were steady, unblinking, holding the weight of 20 years of military command. "What you observed," she repeated slowly, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of a storm gathering strength, "was my honor student daughter walking home from volunteer work, carrying textbooks and wearing a school ID. She was in an area where she didn't belong. She belongs anywhere she has the legal right to be, which, in case your training didn't cover it, includes every public sidewalk in America." Derek's jaw tightened. He'd been a good cop for 15 years, had served his community with dedication and integrity. One mistake, one split-second decision based on years of training and experience, and suddenly he was being painted as some monster. "You don't understand the pressures of police work," he said, leaning forward. "We get these calls all the time. Concerned citizens are reporting suspicious behavior. We have to investigate. We have to be cautious." "Cautious?" Jazz's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, a movement that at once struck fear into the hearts of subordinate soldiers. "You handcuffed a teenager for existing while black. You threw her against a patrol car for asking why she was being detained. You threatened to arrest her for resisting arrest when she tried to show you her school ID. She was argumentative, confrontational. In my experience, in your experience," Jazz interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Intelligent black children who know their rights are automatically threatening. Is that what you're telling me?"
Derek's face flushed red. "That's not what I said. You're twisting my words. I'm reading your words from your own incident report." Jazz slid the document across the table. Subject appeared agitated and non-compliant. Failed to provide identification when requested immediately. Exhibited behaviors consistent with criminal intent. Each phrase hit Derek like a physical blow. Hearing his own words reflected at him, stripped of the adrenaline and assumption that had driven them, they sounded hollow. Worse than hollow, they sounded like exactly what Captain Washington was accusing him of. "I was doing my job," he said quietly. "Your job is to protect and serve. Tell me, Officer Mitchell, how did handcuffing my daughter protect anyone? How did humiliating her in front of her neighbors serve the community?" Derek stared at the table, his mind racing through the events of 2 hours ago. The call had seemed routine. The situation had escalated quickly. By the time Captain Washington arrived, Zoe had been in handcuffs for 12 minutes, her school ID ignored, her explanations dismissed. "She should have been more compliant," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they tasted like ash. Jazz leaned back in her chair, her posture rigid with military bearing. "My daughter has been trained since she could walk to be compliant with police officers. She said yes, sir, and no, sir. She kept her hands visible. She tried to provide identification. She asked permission before reaching for her school ID. She was argumentative. She asked why she was being detained. That's her constitutional right, Officer Mitchell. The same Constitution you swore an oath to defend." Derek's hands trembled slightly.
He thought about his own daughter, Emma, about the piano recital he'd missed last week because of work. What would he want a police officer to do if Emma was walking home from school and got stopped? How would he react if someone handcuffed his child for asking questions? But Zoe Washington wasn't Emma. That was the uncomfortable truth he couldn't quite voice, the distinction that had driven his actions without his conscious awareness. Emma was safe in ways that Zoe apparently wasn't, protected by assumptions that didn't extend to all children equally. "Look," Derek said, trying a different approach, "I understand you're upset. Any parent would be. But you weren't there. You didn't see how she was acting." "How was she acting, Officer Mitchell?" "She was—" Derek paused, trying to summon the justification that had seemed so clear in the moment. "She was walking with purpose, looking around, checking her phone." "Walking with purpose." Jazz repeated the phrase as if she were examining a foreign language. "My daughter was walking home, with purpose, while black." "It's not about race. Then explain to me why." Jazz's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to demanding answers and getting them. "Explain to me why a 16-year-old honor student carrying textbooks and wearing a school ID in broad daylight constitutes suspicious activity requiring handcuffs." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The words that made perfect sense in the heat of the moment, the explanations that had justified his actions to himself, suddenly seemed inadequate. Worse than inadequate, they seemed exactly like what Captain Washington was accusing him of. I was protecting the community." From what? A teenager walking home from volunteer work? From, he struggled to find the words, from potential criminal activity. Based on what evidence? Based on the call we received? Based on her behavior? Based on your assumptions about what a black teenager in a white neighborhood must be up to. Derek's face went white. "That's not fair. I'm not racist. I have black colleagues. I've arrested white criminals. I don't see color." "If you don't see color, Officer Mitchell, then you're willfully blind to the reality my daughter lives with every day. You see color. You acted on color. And my daughter paid the price for your willful ignorance." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of radio chatter from the main floor. Derek stared at his hands, seeing them as if for the first time. These hands had cuffed a child. These hands had pushed a teenager against a car. These hands belonged to someone he never wanted to become.
"I was trying to do the right thing," he whispered. "The right thing would have been to see my daughter as what she is, a child walking home. The right thing would have been to treat her with the dignity and respect you'd want someone to show your own daughter." Derek flinched at the comparison. Emma's face flashed in his mind, trusting, innocent, safe in ways he'd never had to question. What would he do if someone treated Emma the way he'd treated Zoe Washington? "I made a mistake," he said, the admission tearing at his throat. "Yes," Jazz said simply, "you did. The question now is what you're going to do about it." Derek looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since they'd entered the interview room. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that my daughter isn't a mistake to be corrected or a problem to be solved. She's a child who deserves to walk through the world safely. I want you to understand that your badge doesn't give you the right to terrorize children based on your fears and assumptions." "And then what?" Jazz studied him for a long moment, seeing past the uniform to the man underneath. A flawed man who had acted on unconscious bias, but who seemed capable of growth. "And then," she said quietly, "you become the kind of officer this community actually needs. The kind who protects all children, not just the ones who look like they belong." Derek nodded slowly, the weight of transformation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. It would be uncomfortable.
It would require him to examine every assumption, every instinct, every comfortable lie he'd told himself about who he was and what he represented. But looking at Captain Washington, at the fierce love in her eyes, at the strength that had war and motherhood and this moment, Derek realized that comfort was always a luxury he couldn't afford, not if he wanted to deserve the badge he wore.
Derek's hands fidgeted with his pen, clicking it repeatedly until Jazz's steady gaze made him stop. The silence stretched again, filled with everything they weren't saying and everything they needed to address. "I've been a cop for 15 years, Derek said finally. "I thought I was fair. I thought I treated everyone equally." "Thinking and being are two different things," Jazz replied. "I thought I'd prepared Zoe for everything, taught her every strategy, every de-escalation technique. But you can't prepare for someone who's already decided who you are before you open your mouth." Derek wanted to protest, to defend himself, to explain that it hadn't been about race, but the words died in his throat. Because deep down, in the part of himself he'd never examined too closely, he knew she was right. "What happens now?" he asked, genuinely uncertain for the first time in years. "That depends entirely on you," Jazz said, closing her legal pad with deliberate precision. "You can fight this, claim it was a misunderstanding, let your union lawyers paint my daughter as a problem child who brought it on herself. Most officers would. And if I don't?" Jazz studied him for a long moment, her military training evident in the way she assessed threats and opportunities with equal intensity. "Then you do the hardest thing any of us can do. You look in the mirror and decide if you like what you see." Derek's radio crackled with routine dispatch calls, the familiar background noise of police work continuing around them. His colleagues were out there, patrolling the same streets, making the same split-second decisions he'd made tonight. How many of them would end up in this same room, facing the same choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths? "I've been thinking about what she said. Your daughter. When I first approached her, she said, 'Good evening, officer.' Respectful, polite, everything I claim to want from young people. But I still saw threat instead of courtesy." "Why do you think that is?" Jazz asked, her tone shifting slightly from interrogation to genuine curiosity. Derek was quiet for a long time, wrestling with thoughts he'd never been forced to articulate. "My father was a cop, 25 years on the force. He used to say that certain types of people required different approaches, that some communities needed a firmer hand to maintain order." "And you believed him?" "I never questioned it. It was just how things were, how I was trained to see the world." Jazz nodded slowly, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "My father was a master sergeant, 30 years in the Army. He used to tell me that real leadership meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. That true strength was measured by how you treated the vulnerable, not how you dominated the powerful." "Different fathers, different lessons," Derek said. "Same badge, different choices," Jazz countered. "The question is, what are you going to choose going forward?" Derek looked around the interview room, the same room where he had questioned countless suspects, where he had felt the authority of his position like armor around his shoulders. Tonight, that armor felt more like a prison. "I don't know how to fix this," he said honestly. "I don't know how to undo 15 years of seeing the world through the wrong lens." "You don't undo it. You acknowledge it, you own it, and you do better. Every day, with every interaction, you choose to do better." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "Officer Mitchell?" "Yes, ma'am?" "My daughter forgave you tonight. She said you seemed like a good person who made a bad choice. Don't prove her wrong." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Derek alone with the fluorescent lights and the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his career and his character.
Outside, Captain Jasmine Washington walked to her car with the measured stride of someone who'd faced down enemies and emerged victorious. But this victory felt different, not like conquest, but like the first step in a longer battle for hearts and minds. Her phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "How did it go, Mom? Is he going to learn something from tonight?" Jazz smiled as she typed back, "That's up to him, baby girl, but I think there's hope." When has someone's patience and wisdom helped you see your own blind spots? How did you respond to that uncomfortable truth? Share and like the video if you believe that real change happens one conversation, one choice, one moment of courage at a time. What difficult conversation have you been avoiding?
The community center conference room felt smaller than usual, as Derek Mitchell sat across from Captain Washington and Zoe, 3 cups of coffee growing cold between them. 2 days had passed since the incident, 2 days of sleepless nights and soul-searching that had left Derek feeling like a stranger in his own skin. "I want to understand," Derek said quietly, his hands wrapped around his untouched coffee mug. "I need to understand how I became the kind of cop I swore I'd never be." Captain Washington studied him with the same intensity she'd once used to evaluate enemy positions. "What kind of cop did you swear you'd be?" "The kind who protected everyone equally. The kind who saw people, not stereotypes." Derek's voice cracked slightly. "My daughter, Emma, is mixed race. Her mother, my ex-wife, is black. I thought that made me immune to this kind of mistake." Zoe looked up sharply, surprise flickering across her features. This was the first personal detail Derek had shared, and it changed something in the room's atmosphere. "Tell us about Emma," Captain Washington said, her tone softer but still direct. Derek pulled out his phone, showing them a photo of a beautiful 12-year-old girl with café au lait skin and her father's green eyes. "She's everything to me. Smart, talented, brave. She plays violin, wants to be a doctor." He paused, staring at the photo. "She's also starting to ask questions I don't know how to answer." "What kind of questions?" Zoe asked quietly. "Like why some of her friends' parents look at me differently when they find out I'm a cop. Why she gets followed in stores when she's with her mom, but not when she's with me." Derek set the phone down with shaking hands. "Last month, she asked me if I would arrest her if she was walking in the wrong neighborhood." The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. "What did you tell her?" Captain Washington asked. "I told her that would never happen. I told her I'd protect her from anyone who tried to hurt her." Derek's laugh was bitter. "But 2 days ago, I handcuffed someone else's daughter for the same crime I promised to protect my own daughter from." Captain Washington leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "What happened to you, Officer Mitchell? What made you see a threat where there was only a child?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My father." The words seemed to cost him everything to say. "My father was a cop for 30 years. Good cop, everyone said. Community respected him. Department loved him. He taught me everything about police work. How to read a situation, how to stay safe, how to command respect." Derek's jaw tightened. "He also taught me that some neighborhoods were more dangerous than others, that some people were more likely to cause trouble." "Did he say it was about race?" Zoe asked, though they all knew the answer. "He never had to. It was in the stories he told, the warnings he gave, the way he talked about different communities. You can't be too careful with those people, he'd say. They don't think like us." Derek rubbed his temples. "I thought I'd rejected all of that when I married Keisha. I thought love had made me colorblind." "But colorblind isn't the goal," Captain Washington said firmly. "Seeing color isn't the problem. Judging character based on color is." Derek nodded miserably. "I understand that now. But for 15 years,
I carried my father's voice in the back of my head, telling me to be extra careful, extra vigilant, extra suspicious when dealing with young black men, or, apparently, young black women walking through the wrong neighborhoods. "Tell us about that voice," Captain Washington said. It wasn't a request. Derek took a shuddering breath. It started small. A whisper during traffic stops. Watch his hands. A nudge during neighborhood patrols. Keep your guard up in this area. A reminder during community events. They might seem friendly, but stay alert. He looked up at them with haunted eyes. I thought I was being a good cop. I thought hypervigilance meant thoroughness. But hypervigilance became hyper-suspicion, and hyper-suspicion became prejudice wearing a badge. Yes. The admission seemed to break something inside Derek. I've been living two lives without realizing it. The father who would die to protect my mixed-race daughter, and the cop who sees mixed-race daughters as potential threats when they belong to someone else.
Zoe spoke up, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Do you know what it's like to excel at everything? Honor roll, debate team, volunteer work, and still have people look at you like you don't belong? Derek shook his head. It's exhausting, Zoe continued. Every day I have to prove I deserve to exist in spaces that Emma probably takes for granted. I have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and even then, one wrong move, one misunderstanding, one officer having a bad day. She gestured to herself. And I'm in handcuffs for walking while black. I'm so sorry, Derek whispered. I'm so incredibly sorry. Sorry isn't enough, Captain Washington said, but her tone wasn't cruel. What matters is what you do with this knowledge, how you change, how you grow, how you use your position to make sure this doesn't happen to other daughters. Derek nodded, wiping his eyes. I want to do better. I need to do better. For Emma, for Zoe, for everyone I've sworn to protect. Then let me tell you about the voice in my head, Captain Washington said, her military bearing softening slightly. It's the voice of every black mother who's had to explain to her child why the world sees them as dangerous before it sees them as human. It's the voice that says, come home safe, instead of just have a good day. It's the voice that practices funeral speeches while packing school lunches. Derek felt the weight of her words like physical blows. I've carried that voice through 2 combat deployments, Officer Mitchell. I've listened to it during every phone call, every late night, every moment my daughter is out of my sight. And 2 days ago, that voice screamed at me to run toward the sound of trouble because I knew, somehow I knew that my worst fears were coming true. How do you live with that fear? Derek asked. The same way you live with the responsibility of a badge, she replied. One day at a time, trying to make the world safer for the people you love. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of truth settling between them like sediment in still water. Finally, Zoe spoke. Officer Mitchell? Yes? Emma's going to face what I face someday. Maybe not as much, maybe not as often, but she will. The question is, what kind of world are you going to help build for her? Derek looked at this remarkable young woman, the same age as his daughter, the same dreams, the same right to walk through the world without fear, and felt the last of his comfortable illusions crumble away. A better one, he said, his voice strong for the first time in days. I'm going to help build a better one. What voices from your past still influence your present decisions, and are they serving you or holding you back from growth? Share if you believe that uncomfortable conversations about bias are necessary for real change. What would you want the officers in your community to understand about your experience? 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and the Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with an energy that felt different, purposeful, hopeful. Derek Mitchell stood awkwardly by the registration table, his civilian clothes making him feel more exposed than his uniform had ever.
Tonight was the first session of the community dialogue program that Captain Washington had proposed, and his presence here felt both necessary and terrifying. "Officer Mitchell," a warm voice called behind him. He turned to see Zoe Washington approaching, her smile genuine but cautious. She wore a simple T-shirt that read "Future Doctor" in bold letters, and her natural hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail that somehow made her look both younger and more mature than her 16 years. "Just Derek tonight," he said, extending his hand. "And I owe you another apology." Zoe shook his hand firmly, a grip her mother had clearly taught her. "Mom says healing starts with showing up. So, thank you for showing up." The simple grace in her words hit Derek harder than any lecture could have. This was the girl he'd handcuffed, the honor student he'd reduced to a stereotype in his mind. Now, looking at her clear eyes and steady demeanor, he felt the full weight of his actions settle in his chest. "Derek," Captain Washington's voice carried across the room, and he turned to see her approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She was dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, her military bearing softened but still unmistakable. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Almost didn't," Derek admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I gave you my word." "Words are easy," Jazz said, but her tone wasn't harsh. "Being here when it's uncomfortable, that's harder."
They found seats in the circle of folding chairs as other community members filtered in. Derek recognized faces from his patrol routes. The elderly woman whose cat he'd helped rescue from a tree. The teenager who'd thanked him for breaking up a fight at the bus stop. The shop owner who always waved when Derek drove by. Seeing them outside the context of police calls felt strange and enlightening. "Before we begin," Jazz announced to the group, "I want to establish something important. We're not here to attack anyone or assign blame. We're here to understand each other better, to build bridges where walls have been built by fear and misunderstanding." Mrs. Chen, an elderly Asian woman Derek had encountered during a break-in call, raised her hand. "Captain Washington, many of us appreciate what you're doing, but how do we know things will really change? Because change starts with conversations like this one. Derek, would you like to share why you're here?" Derek's mouth went dry. 20 people were looking at him expectantly, including the girl he'd wrongfully arrested and the mother he disrespected. Every instinct told him to deflect, to give a safe professional answer. Instead, he chose truth. "I'm here because I was wrong," he said, his voice rough but steady. 2 weeks ago, I let my assumptions override my training and my humanity. I saw a black teenager in what I considered the wrong neighborhood, and I made decisions based on bias I didn't even realize I carried. The room was silent, but not uncomfortably so. It felt like the silence before something important happened. "My daughter, Emma, is 16. She's white, she's privileged, and she's never had to worry about being profiled or questioned just for existing in her own community. Zoe is also 16, just as smart, just as deserving of respect and safety. The only difference is the color of their skin, and that difference has shaped their entire experience of the world." "What opened your eyes to that?" asked Marcus, a young black father Derek had met during a domestic disturbance call that turned out to be a false alarm. Derek looked at Jazz, who nodded encouragingly. "Captain Washington didn't just correct my behavior. She made me see the person behind the badge. She showed me that accountability isn't punishment, it's responsibility. And Zoe," he turned to the teenager who was listening intently, "Zoe showed me grace I didn't deserve. She could have been angry, could have written me off as just another racist cop. Instead, she gave me the chance to do better." "That's my daughter," Jazz said softly, pride evident in her voice. "She's always seen the potential in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." Zoe blushed but spoke up confidently. "I learned from my mom that anger without action is just noise. But action without understanding doesn't create real change.
Officer, Derek, you're here because you want to understand. That's the first step towards real change. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Derek had experienced in 15 years of community policing. These weren't complaints or demands. They were stories. Mrs. Chin shared her fear of being dismissed as a non-English speaker, despite having 2 PhDs. Marcus talked about teaching his sons to be respectful to police, while knowing that respect might not be enough to keep them safe. And slowly, Derek began to share too. He talked about his father's influence, about the culture of the police force that sometimes prioritized authority over empathy. He talked about his divorce, his strained relationship with his daughter, and the way his job had hardened him without him realizing it. The hardest part is realizing that good intentions aren't enough. I thought I was a fair cop because I wasn't actively trying to hurt anyone, but I never examined the lens I was looking through. "What are you going to do differently?" asked Sarah, a young mother who'd been pulled over 3 times in the past year for what she felt were pretextual stops. "I'm starting with education," Derek said, pulling out his phone. "Captain Washington recommended some books and documentaries. I'm also requesting additional bias training for our department, and I'm asking to be part of the community liaison program." Jazz smiled, the first fully genuine smile she'd given him since their encounter. "That's not just talk, Derek. That's taking ownership." As the session wound down, people lingered, continuing conversations in smaller groups. Derek found himself talking with Marcus about fatherhood, sharing concerns about raising kids in a complicated world. The conversation felt natural, human, in a way his interactions rarely were while in uniform. "Derek," Zoe approached him as people began to leave, "would you like to meet my mom's friend, Lieutenant Rodriguez? He's been working on police reform initiatives. Mom thought you might be interested in learning more." The offer of connection, of continued growth, felt like a gift Derek wasn't sure he'd earned. "I'd like that very much."
As they walked toward the parking lot, Jazz fell into step beside Derek. "You know, tonight was just the beginning. Real change is messy, it's ongoing, and it requires courage, even when no one's watching." "I'm starting to understand that," Derek said. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I'm a soldier, Derek. We don't leave people behind. We help them become who they're supposed to be." Under the streetlights of the community center parking lot, something had shifted. Not everything was fixed. Trust would take time to rebuild, systems would need to change, and the work of understanding would continue long after tonight. But for the first time since the incident, Derek felt something he hadn't expected: hope. And in Zoe's proud smile as she hugged her mother goodnight, he saw the future they were all working toward, a world where every child could walk safely through their own neighborhood, where respect was given freely, and where second chances led to real change. When have you experienced the transformative power of genuine dialogue across difference? What made that conversation meaningful? Share this if you believe that real change happens when people choose courage over comfort and connection over division. What bridges are you willing to help build? The community meeting had been Derek's idea, a gesture of goodwill that he'd hoped would demonstrate his commitment to change. 2 months after the incident with Zoe, he'd volunteered to participate in the police department's new community engagement program, believing that his transformation could serve as a bridge between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. He'd been wrong. The Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with tension as Derek walked through the doors, his civilian clothes feeling foreign after so many years in uniform. He'd requested the evening off, had prepared talking points about implicit bias training and procedural reforms. What he hadn't prepared for was the wall of hostility that hit him like a physical force. "That's him," someone whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. "That's the cop who handcuffed the Washington girl." Derek's steps faltered as heads turned, conversations stopped, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. He'd expected some resistance, but this felt different, deeper, more personal than professional disagreement. Captain Washington sat in the front row, her posture military straight, her expression unreadable. Zoe was beside her,
no longer the frightened teenager from that evening, but a poised young woman whose eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution. They'd agreed to this meeting, had been instrumental in organizing it, but Derek suddenly wondered if he'd misunderstood their intentions. "Officer Mitchell," called Mrs. Henderson, the community center director, her voice professionally neutral but notably cold. "Thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate your willingness to engage in this dialogue." Derek nodded, taking the empty chair across from the assembled crowd of about 30 people. Faces he didn't recognize stared back at him. Parents, teenagers, elderly residents, all united by their shared experience of living in communities where his badge represented both protection and threat. "I want to start by saying," Derek began, his prepared words feeling inadequate in the face of so much raw emotion, "that the incident with Zoe opened my eyes to—" "The incident!" interrupted a voice from the middle of the room. A young black man about Derek's age stood up, his expression incredulous. "You mean when you racially profiled a 16-year-old honor student and put her in handcuffs for walking while black?" The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, and Derek felt his face flush with embarrassment and defensiveness. "That's not— yes, that's what happened, but I want you to understand that it wasn't intentional." "Intent doesn't matter when the impact is trauma," said another voice, this time an older black woman whose authoritative tone reminded Derek uncomfortably of his own mother. "That child could have been killed because of your unintentional bias." Derek's throat constricted. He'd spent weeks in therapy, had completed bias training, had read books and attended seminars, but sitting here, facing the community he'd sworn to protect, he realized that his internal work meant nothing if he couldn't translate it into understanding their lived experience. "You're right," he said, quietly, and the room fell silent. "You're absolutely right. My intent doesn't erase the harm I caused, and it doesn't change the fact that Zoe experienced something traumatic because of my actions." Captain Washington leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp and assessing. Derek had the uncomfortable feeling that she was evaluating him the way she might evaluate a potential threat, cataloging weaknesses, measuring responses, preparing for multiple scenarios. "Tell us what you've learned," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded soldiers in combat zones.
Derek took a shaky breath, abandoning his prepared remarks. "I learned that I was scared," he said, the admission feeling like swallowing glass. "I was scared of young black men, scared of situations I didn't understand, scared of looking weak or losing control. And I taught myself to call that fear caution and good police work." A teenager in the back row snorted with disgust. "So we're supposed to feel sorry for you because you were scared? We're scared every day, and we don't get to handcuff innocent people because of it." No, Derek said quickly. "No, you shouldn't feel sorry for me. That's not what I'm asking for. I'm trying to explain how I got so far off track, how I became someone who could look at a 16-year-old girl and see a threat instead of a child." "You saw a black girl," Zoe spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. "That's what you saw. Everything else, the assumptions, the aggression, the handcuffs, that all came from seeing my skin color first and my humanity second." The words hit Derek like physical blows. He'd been trying for months to find more palatable ways to discuss what had happened, to frame it in terms of training deficits and procedural errors. But Zoe's simple truth cut through all his careful language to the brutal core of the matter. "Yes," he said, whispered, then louder. "Yes, you're right. I saw your race before I saw you as a person, and everything that followed came from that fundamental failure." "And now what?" demanded the young man who'd spoken earlier. "Now you feel bad about it, so we're supposed to forgive and forget? Move on like it never happened?" Derek shook his head, feeling the weight of expectation and skepticism pressing down on him.
I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I'm hoping for is a chance to do better, to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." "Pretty words," said the older woman, her tone skeptical. "But what does that actually look like? What changes when you go back to work tomorrow?" Derek had prepared for this question, had spent hours crafting responses about policy changes and training programs. But sitting here, facing people whose lives were affected by his choices, those institutional answers felt hollow. "I honestly don't know," he admitted, and the room stirred with surprise at his candor. "I mean, I know about the training programs and the new policies, but those are just band-aids if officers like me don't fundamentally change how we see the communities we serve." "So how do you change?" Captain Washington asked, her voice carrying a challenge that Derek recognized from his military father, the tone of someone who demanded results, not excuses. Derek looked around the room, seeing faces that reflected pain, anger, hope, and deep exhaustion. These weren't abstract concepts from a diversity training manual. These were neighbors whose children walked the same streets he patrolled, whose lives intersected with his authority in ways he'd never bothered to consider. "I honestly don't know," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I know that what I've been doing isn't working. I know that good intentions without understanding are dangerous, and I know that I can't fix this alone." A long silence stretched across the room, heavy with unspoken history and cautious possibility. Derek felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never experienced in uniform. The badge and gun that usually defined his interactions were absent, leaving only his humanity and his desperate desire to be worthy of the trust he'd betrayed. Finally, Zoe spoke again. "The thing is," she said, looking directly at Derek, "this isn't really about you. It's about every black kid who has to worry about walking through their own neighborhood. It's about parents like my mom who have to prepare their children for encounters that shouldn't be dangerous, but often are." Derek nodded, understanding beginning to dawn that this wasn't about his redemption or his peace of mind. This was about systemic change that would outlive his career, about creating a world where other children wouldn't experience what Zoe had endured. "So what do I do?" he asked, not rhetorically, but genuinely seeking guidance from people who understood the problem better than he ever could. The answers that came weren't what he'd expected, weren't the simple steps to absolution he'd hoped for. Instead, they were the beginning of a much longer, harder journey, one that would require him to confront not just his own biases, but the systems and structures that had allowed them to flourish unchallenged. By the time the meeting ended, Derek understood that his moment of recognition was just the first step. The real work, the daily choice to see clearly, to act justly, to serve all members of his community with equal dignity, was only beginning. How do you respond when confronted with the unintended harm your actions or assumptions have caused others? Share if you believe that real change requires more than good intentions. It demands sustained action and accountability. What systems in your community need examining? 3 weeks had passed since the community meeting that had torn Derek Mitchell's world apart. 3 weeks of sleepless nights staring at the ceiling of his empty apartment while Zoe Washington's words echoed in his mind. You saw a threat where there was only a teenage girl trying to make her community better.
The internal affairs investigation had been swift and thorough. No criminal charges. His actions, while morally questionable, had been within department policy. But policy, Derek had learned, was a poor substitute for conscience. He sat in his car outside the Willowbrook Community Center, hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Through the windows, he could see the after-school program in session, kids of all colors working together on homework, laughing together, being kids together, the way it should be, the way he'd failed to see it. His phone buzzed with another message from his daughter, Emma.
Dad, I saw the news article about you online. Can we talk? Derek's heart sank. The local newspaper had run a follow-up story about the community policing reforms, mentioning his name and the incident. His 15-year-old daughter, the light of his life, was now reading about his father's failures in black and white. He'd been avoiding her calls for days, too ashamed to explain how the man she'd looked up to had become the cautionary tale in someone else's story of injustice. A knock on his passenger window made Derek jump. Captain Washington stood there, not in her intimidating military bearing, but in civilian clothes, jeans and a community center volunteer t-shirt. She gestured for him to roll down the window. "Captain?" Derek stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Jazz," she corrected firmly. "And you're Derek. Not Officer Mitchell, not the man who arrested my daughter. Derek, Emma's father, right?" Derek's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know the people who impact my daughter's life," Jazz said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Your daughter Emma goes to Jefferson High with Zoe. Honor rolls, student council, volunteers at the animal shelter. Sound about right?" Derek nodded numbly, unsure where this was going. "She's been asking questions about what happened. Tough questions about her father's choices." Jazz's expression softened slightly. "Zoe told me Emma approached her at school yesterday, asked if she could apologize for what you did." The words hit Derek like a physical blow. His daughter, his 15-year-old daughter, felt the need to apologize for his actions. The shame was suffocating. "I don't know how to face her," Derek whispered, his voice breaking like a teenager's. "I don't know how to explain that her father is the kind of man I used to think I wasn't." Jazz studied him for a long moment, her trained eye assessing not the threat he'd once represented, but the broken man before her now. "Get out of the car," she said. Derek hesitated, then complied, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk as Jazz closed the distance between them. "You want to know what Zoe told Emma?" Jazz asked. "She said your daughter shouldn't carry the weight of your mistakes, but that she could be part of the solution if she wanted to be." Derek's throat constricted. "What does that mean?" "It means my daughter, the girl you handcuffed for walking while black, is tutoring your daughter in AP history twice a week. It means she's teaching Emma about the civil rights movement, about systemic racism, about the difference between performative allyship and genuine change." Derek stared at Jazz in amazement. "Why would she do that?" "Because that's who she is," she said simply. "Because she understands that your daughter isn't responsible for your choices, but she can choose to be better educated about the world she's inheriting." They stood in silence for a moment, watching through the community center windows as teenagers of all backgrounds worked side by side. "I resigned from the force yesterday," Derek said quietly. "I heard. What's next?" "I don't know," Derek admitted. "I've been a cop for 15 years. It's all I know how to be." "That's not true," Jazz said, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had once led soldiers through combat. "You know how to be a father. You know how to love your daughter. You know how to recognize when you've made a mistake." Derek looked at her, confusion clear in her eyes. "The question is," Jazz continued, "what are you going to do with that knowledge?" The internal affairs investigation had been swift and thorough. No criminal charges. His actions, while morally questionable, had been within department policy. But policy, Derek had learned, was a poor substitute for conscience. He sat in his car outside the Willowbrook Community Center, hands gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. Through the windows, he could see the after-school program in session, kids of all colors working together on homework, laughing together, being kids together. The way it should be. The way he'd failed to see it. His phone buzzed with another message from his daughter, Emma. "Dad, I saw the news article about you online. Can we talk?" Derek's heart sank. The local newspaper had run a follow-up story about the community policing reforms, mentioning his name and the incident. His 15-year-old daughter, the light of his life, was now reading about his father's failures in black and white. He'd been avoiding her calls for days, too ashamed to explain how the man she'd looked up to had become the cautionary tale in someone else's story of injustice. A knock on his passenger window made Derek jump. Captain Washington stood there, not in her intimidating military bearing, but in civilian clothes, jeans and a community center volunteer t-shirt. She gestured for him to roll down the window. "Captain?" Derek stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Jazz," she corrected firmly. "And you're Derek. Not Officer Mitchell, not the man who arrested my daughter. Derek, Emma's father, right?" Derek's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know the people who impact my daughter's life," Jazz said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Your daughter Emma goes to Jefferson High with Zoe. Honor rolls, student council, volunteers at the animal shelter. Sound about right?" Derek nodded numbly, unsure where this was going. "She's been asking questions about what happened. Tough questions about her father's choices." Jazz's expression softened slightly. "Zoe told me Emma approached her at school yesterday, asked if she could apologize for what you did." The words hit Derek like a physical blow. His daughter, his 15-year-old daughter, felt the need to apologize for his actions. The shame was suffocating. "I don't know how to face her," Derek whispered, his voice breaking like a teenager's. "I don't know how to explain that her father is the kind of man I used to think I wasn't." Jazz studied him for a long moment, her trained eye assessing not the threat he'd once represented, but the broken man before her now. "Get out of the car," she said. Derek hesitated, then complied, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk as Jazz closed the distance between them. "You want to know what Zoe told Emma?" Jazz asked. "She said your daughter shouldn't carry the weight of your mistakes, but that she could be part of the solution if she wanted to be." Derek's throat constricted. "What does that mean?" "It means my daughter, the girl you handcuffed for walking while black, is tutoring your daughter in AP history twice a week. It means she's teaching Emma about the civil rights movement, about systemic racism, about the difference between performative allyship and genuine change." Derek stared at Jazz in amazement. "Why would she do that?" "Because that's who she is," she said simply. "Because she understands that your daughter isn't responsible for your choices, but she can choose to be better educated about the world she's inheriting." They stood in silence for a moment, watching through the community center windows as teenagers of all backgrounds worked side by side. "I resigned from the force yesterday," Derek said quietly. "I heard. What's next?" "I don't know," Derek admitted. "I've been a cop for 15 years. It's all I know how to be." "That's not true," Jazz said, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had once led soldiers through combat. "You know how to be a father. You know how to love your daughter. You know how to recognize when you've made a mistake." Derek looked at her, confusion clear in her eyes. "The question is," Jazz continued, "what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Derek's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, scrolling to Emma's unanswered messages. 15 texts, 7 missed calls, his daughter trying to reach him while he wallowed in self-pity and shame. "I don't know how to start," he whispered. "You start by showing up," Jazz said firmly. "You start by listening. You start by admitting you were wrong and asking what you can do to be better." Derek looked through the community center windows again, seeing not the threat he'd once imagined, but the hope he'd nearly destroyed. Kids helping kids. Differences celebrated instead of feared. Community built through understanding instead of division. Would you, Derek's voice caught, would you and Zoe be willing to help me understand? To teach me what I clearly never learned? Jazz was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity she'd once used to assess battlefield conditions. That depends, she said finally. Are you asking because you think it'll make you feel better about yourself, or are you asking because you genuinely want to be part of the solution? Derek met her gaze directly for the first time since that horrible night 3 weeks ago. I want to be better, he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. I want to be better for Emma, for Zoe, for every kid who deserves to walk through this world without fear. I want to be the man I thought I already was. Jazz nodded slowly. Then we start tomorrow, 7 p.m., Community Center Conference Room. You, me, Emma, Zoe, and some other parents who've been working on bridging these divides. What do I need to bring? Nothing but your willingness to listen and learn. And Derek, your daughter is proud of you for resigning. She told Zoe that it takes courage. Derek's eyes filled with tears. I need to call her. Yes, you do, Jazz agreed. And Derek, when you do, remember that she's been waiting for her father to choose growth over pride. Don't keep her waiting any longer. As Jazz walked back toward the community center, Derek remained standing beside his car, phone in hand, facing the hardest conversation of his life. But for the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than shame. He felt hope. His finger hovered over Emma's contact, then pressed call. She answered on the first ring. Dad? Emma's voice was tentative but hopeful. Hi, sweetheart. I'm sorry I haven't called. I'm sorry about a lot of things. Can we talk? I've been waiting, Emma said softly. I love you, Dad, no matter what. Derek closed his eyes, overwhelmed by his daughter's unconditional love and his own unworthiness of it. I love you too, Em, and I promise I'm going to be better. We're going to be better. Through the community center windows, he could see Jazz talking to Zoe, both of them glancing in his direction, not with hostility, but with cautious optimism. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the hardest education of his life, but today he'd made the choice that mattered most, to show up, to listen, and to let love guide him toward the man he wanted to become. When faced with the choice between pride and growth, which voice do you listen to, and what does that choice say about who you want to be? Share this if you believe that real change starts with the courage to admit our mistakes and the humility to learn from those we've wronged. What conversations are you avoiding that could lead to healing? 1 year later, the Willowbrook Community Center buzzed with energy as families gathered for the annual Youth Achievement Awards ceremony. The same building where Zoe Washington had been volunteering when her life changed forever, now served as a symbol of transformation and hope. Captain Jasmine Washington, now 39, stood at the back of the auditorium in her dress blues, her chest adorned with ribbons that told the story of service and sacrifice. But tonight, her proudest moment had nothing to do with military achievements and everything to do with the young woman taking the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, this year's recipient of the Outstanding Youth Leadership Award is Miss Zoe Washington, founder of the Bridge Gilding Initiative. The applause was thunderous as 17-year-old Zoe approached the podium, her natural confidence radiating through the room. She'd grown in the past year, not just in height, but in purpose and power. The girl who'd been handcuffed for walking while black had transformed her trauma into triumph.
A year ago, Zoe began, her voice steady and strong.
I was arrested for the crime of existing in a space where some people didn't think I belonged. But that moment of injustice became the catalyst for something beautiful. Jazz felt her throat tighten with pride as she watched her daughter command the room with the same presence that had made Jazz a respected military leader. The Bridge Building Initiative has connected over 500 young people with law enforcement officers for real conversations about bias, fear, and hope. We've facilitated community dialogues that have changed policies and, more importantly, changed hearts. In the third row, Officer Derek Mitchell, now 43, applauded with tears streaming down his face. The past year had been the hardest of his life, but also the most meaningful. The man who'd once let unconscious bias guide his decisions now served as the police department's community liaison officer, dedicating his career to building the bridges his ignorance had once burned. After the ceremony, the three of them stood together in the center's lobby, an unlikely trio bound by a moment of darkness that had somehow led to light. "Zoe," Derek said, his voice still carrying the weight of remorse, but also the strength of genuine change. "I need you to know that what you've built, what you've taught me, it saved more than just my career. It saved who I am as a person." Jazz studied the man who'd handcuffed her daughter. The arrogance was gone, replaced by humility. The defensive anger had transformed into genuine curiosity about perspectives different from his own. Most importantly, the unconscious bias that had driven his actions had been replaced by a conscious commitment to justice. "Officer Mitchell," she said formally, then softened her tone. "Derek, a year ago, I saw you as the enemy. But watching you do the work, real work, not just apologies, has shown me something I learned in the military. People can change when they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves." Derek nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "Captain Washington, I can't undo what I did to Zoe, but I can spend the rest of my career making sure no other parent has to experience what you went through. And no other kid has to experience what I went through," Zoe added, her voice carrying both forgiveness and firm boundaries. "But Derek, you've proven that people can grow. The Police Academy training program we developed together is already being implemented in 3 other districts." It was true. What had started as court-mandated community service had evolved into a comprehensive reform program. Derek's willingness to be vulnerable about his mistakes, combined with Jazz's strategic expertise and Zoe's generational perspective, had created something unprecedented, a model for meaningful police community engagement. "There's something else," Derek said, pulling out his phone to show them a photo of a young black boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing a junior police officer badge. "My nephew Marcus is part of the Youth Police Academy program Zoe designed. He told me yesterday that he wants to be a police officer so he can protect people like Officer Derek learned to do." Jazz felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the protective armor she'd worn for so long. "Your nephew sounds like a smart kid." "He is, and he's growing up in a world where officers like me are learning to do better because of what your daughter taught us." Zoe grinned, the expression transforming her face with youthful joy. "Mom, remember what you always told me about turning obstacles into opportunities?" "Every setback is a setup for a comeback," Jazz recited, smiling at her daughter's wisdom. "Well," Zoe continued, "I got into Stanford early admission last week." Jazz's eyes widened, her military composure cracking with maternal pride. "Zoe, when did you find out?" "This morning. I wanted to tell you both together because—" Zoe looked between her mother and Derek. "Because this whole experience taught me that my major isn't just about what I want to study, but what the world needs me to learn." "What are you studying?" asked Derek, though something in his expression suggested he already knew. "Criminal justice with a focus on community policing reform. And I've been accepted into their pre-law program.
Zoe's smile was radiant. "I'm going to be a lawyer, but not the kind who just wins cases, the kind that changes systems." Jazz felt tears she rarely allowed herself to shed building behind her eyes. Her daughter, her brilliant, brave, beautiful daughter, had taken the worst moment of her young life and transformed it into her life's mission. "There's something else," Derek said quietly. "The department approved my request to create a scholarship fund in Zoe's name for students pursuing criminal justice degrees. We want to support more young people who can help bridge the divide." "The Zoe Washington Community Justice Scholarship," Jazz said softly, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." As they talked, other families approached, parents thanking Zoe for her leadership, young people seeking mentorship, community members expressing gratitude for the changes they'd seen in local policing. The girl who'd been seen as a threat was now recognized as a treasure.
"You know what the best part is?" Zoe said as the crowd began to thin. "Remember that day, Mom, when you told the chief that respect isn't given, it's earned?" Jazz nodded, remembering the steel in her own voice as she'd faced down the police department's leadership. "Well, I think all three of us have earned something better than we started with. Derek earned redemption through action. You earned justice through persistence. And I earned my voice through refusing to be silenced." Derek extended his hand to Jazz, not the gesture of an authority figure to a subordinate, but the respect of one warrior to another. "Captain Washington, it's been an honor learning from you and your daughter." Jazz shook his hand firmly. "Officer Mitchell, thank you for being willing to do the hard work of change. Not everyone would have." As they prepared to part ways, Zoe had one final surprise. "Actually, there's something I want to show you both." She led them to the community center's newly renovated entrance where a bronze plaque had been installed. "In honor of those who transform moments of injustice into opportunities for justice. Dedicated to every young person who refuses to be defined by others' limitations, and to every adult willing to grow beyond their mistakes. May we build bridges where others see walls." Below the inscription were three names: Zoe Washington, Captain Jasmine Washington, and Officer Derek Mitchell. "The real victory," Zoe said softly, "isn't that we survived that day. It's what we used it to make sure other families won't have to." Jazz pulled her daughter close, her heart full of pride and hope. The warrior mother who'd fought for her country had raised a daughter who would fight for justice. The officer who'd acted from fear had learned to lead with courage. And the girl who'd been seen as suspicious had proven herself to be extraordinary. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the most painful moments. Sometimes the people who hurt us become the people who help us grow. And sometimes love and justice are the same thing. In the end, they'd all learned that real authority comes not from the power to control others, but from the courage to change ourselves. How can you transform a moment of injustice or pain in your life into an opportunity to create positive change for others? Share this story if you believe in the power of redemption, growth, and turning our worst moments into our greatest victories. What bridges are you building in your community?
Thank you for joining us and watching this story unfold all the way to the end. The fact that you stayed with us means the world. And if you found yourself captivated by every twist and turn of this tale, then I can promise you, with absolute certainty, that you are going to be completely obsessed with what comes next. It's a story even crazier and more gut-wrenching than you can ever imagine. So don't hesitate. Click on the image showing on your screen right now and dive into your next addiction.